Welcome everyone to the Family Office Investors panel at Digital RESI June. We have a great panel lineup and featuring 5 investors who are coming from active family office investment backgrounds, and they're very excited to share their insights with you all. So I'd like to particularly thank Scott from AMZAC Health, who will be moderating this session. And Scott, I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Claire, and welcome everyone. So we really appreciate everyone joining this panel and spending an hour of your day with us. We'll try to make this as informative and interesting as possible. With that in mind, we do have a chat room, so if you ever have questions, please feel free to do that. Don't be shy, and we'll get to as many as we can. We are going to really focus on an introduction of our panelists and then have a good discussion on how family offices operate, how we approach early stage investing, how we source opportunities, especially how that's relevant for your audience. And we'll also provide some advice from our standpoint on for early stage companies and how to approach us and raise capital successfully. So as Claire mentioned, my name is Scott Wiener. I'm at AMZAC Health. I'm the moderator here. AMZAC focuses on both biotech and medtech investing 50-50, and I lead our biotech effort. And I've been a venture capitalist for 20 years, and AMZAC is in essence the life science investment arm of the family office. So with that, I want to, more importantly, turn it over to our great panelists here, and we'll start with some introductions, and then we'll get right into it. So maybe we'll start with Nadav.
Sure. Thank you, Scott. So Nadav Shimoni, pleasure being here, and thank you for having me. I represent Arkin Holdings. Arkin Holdings is the largest Israeli healthcare investor, managing more than $1.5 billion across all healthcare, and being a single family office that grew substantially throughout the years. I lead digital health investments for Arkin. You can find a lot of information in our website and in our blog. I'm a physician by background, kind of like spent my career between the clinical side and the investment side, and I've been with Arkin for the past year.
Sam?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Scott. Like Nadav, I'm a physician as well. I came about this route a little differently. I'm an ophthalmologist, and I specialized in plastic and reconstructive surgery around the eyes and face. I did that for 24 years full time, and then decided I wanted to expand my horizons a little bit. I went back to business school full time, and then I started working in private equity. From there, I decided that it was a great 2 years, and then I said I want to actually go and do something back in healthcare, and I aimed more towards healthcare investing, early stage healthcare investing. I founded a family office, and then a few months ago, I launched a VC firm, Ambit Healthcare, and that's currently what I'm doing right now.
Great, thank you, Sam. Now we'll turn it over to Sherry for an introduction.
Yes, thank you, Scott, and thank you, Claire, for inviting me to participate. This is great. I'm Sherry Grieswood, and I represent Fox Hill Asset Management. We're a small single-family office that the members are all siblings, which is a little different. Our investment focus is 100% life sciences. Like many family offices, the strategy here is to give back. And healthcare being one of the most important areas of our lives, the family felt that this was an excellent way of doing that. We focus on transformative and disruptive technologies because of our small size. So we are opportunistic that way. We are agnostic in relation to either it's pharma, diagnostic, or device. My role is senior investment officer. I do the deal origination and a large part of the due diligence. My background is I have a Bachelor of Science degree. I'm chartered financial analyst, worked on the street my entire career, about a third of that as an equity analyst and an investment banking due diligence analyst. And the last 20 years as an investment banker, totally focused in this space. So it's with that background that it's been practical as a small family office for them to enter into areas that are maybe more difficult if they didn't have access to somebody who has spent their entire life in this business.
Great. And finally, Hannah.
Scott and Claire, thank you for the invitation. Really glad to be here. I'm managing director of Wu Capital. We're a single family office. We manage the wealth of one self-made entrepreneur who's still young, continuing to grow her wealth. And we focus only on US-based early stage biotech venture investing. And by that, I mean somewhere between C to Series B. We have a very sufficient and patient capital source. And so that allows us to play either syndicate members, or we also lead deals as appropriate. My own path into venture was a bit torturous. I trained like Sam and Nadav as a physician and also as a scientist. And then following that, made my way into management consulting, and then finally into the first fund I was at, 5AM Ventures, which is a blue chip early stage healthcare fund in the US. About 4 years ago, I started the US office at Wu Capital and continue to lead our US biotech strategy.
Great. So after those great introductions, we'll jump right into our first topic, which is the family office. So a lot of you may or may not have worked or approached family offices before. So we wanted to really make sure you have a good sense of how family offices operate and how we are similar or different from traditional venture firms. So I think the first question really would be, how does your office operate different than traditional venture firms? And maybe we'll start with Nadav.
Sure. So we'd like to think about ourselves as a combination between, a very broad and fundamental investor, yet a flexible family office. So we invest either by funds we establish as the anchor investor, and we partner only with Israeli institutional players in these funds, or we just invest purely off the balance sheet. We invest in different stages. Basically, for each field, biotech, devices, digital, we have a specific thesis and team working on this thesis, trying to be laser focused per field and as diligent as possible. I would say that we lead deals, we can follow, we'll do whatever syndication that works best for the company and for the specific deal. And we invest either in Israel or globally, mainly in the US.
Okay. And Sam, from your perspective, how's your effort similar or different to traditional venture funds?
So I started with a family office, and really you look at deals that fit your investment thesis, but you have a lot of leeway, right? You can decide that you like certain things. They're not exactly what you set, as your original criteria, but if you can figure out the way things fit, and it's pretty easy to work through things and not have like a real hard, fast rule of what you're going to do. I can tell you that right now I'm running a venture firm and I can't do that anymore. Okay. When we have an investment thesis and I have to speak to my investors, I cannot veer from what I told them I was going to invest in. So it's a lot different dealing with a venture firm, in my opinion, that way than dealing with a family office, because when I was in the family office, it was a lot more friendly to work with. That's a good way to put it.
Helpful. And I know when I took my first job in a family office after spending almost 18 years on the institutional side, I wasn't sure what I was getting into, to be honest. It's a different investor base, as everyone knows, and you're really focused on appeasing one potential family or person as opposed to a diverse set of investors. So I think it's, for me, it was an interesting learning process. But maybe Hannah, turning to you. So one question I had when I started at AMZAC was, how involved is the quote unquote family? Are they going to be active, passive? How frequently the interactions? So it'd be interesting to hear your perspective, Hannah, on how your fund is structured and how you guys approach that.
Sure. So our principal is very involved, I would say, in the family office. However, I think from the very beginning, and it was part of what attracted me to Wu Capital, was that she has great admiration for, I think, people with particular expertise in specific sectors. And since our overall portfolio spans across different industry sectors and geographies, along each one of those verticals, there are people who are in charge of that. And I would say our principal really does trust and rely on us to provide the right technical assessment. Having said that, I would say, every fund is different, and then every family office is even more different, right? And because it has very much to do with the principal and their current interest, and also desire at that moment in time. And so, I would say what I have seen in terms of the evolution with, Wu Capital US and our activities in the US biotech space, is that there has continued to be growing interest. In the same way, I think that's been also the broader trend of the market, particularly over the course of the last year, bringing to the forefront the importance and the value that I think biotech innovation and investments can play. And so, in the day-to-day, I would say we're fairly autonomous in the US. I think we do our work, and then only when we really feel that an opportunity is exciting and we have the conviction to really pound the table, do we then engage our principal in that dialogue. But I think certainly she's very involved. And then to the extent that it's necessary or beneficial to our portfolio companies, we also leverage the resources of the entire family office, our principal's resources, of course, in assisting with our company. So it is a learning process. I agree with you and Sam. And, I would say trust goes both ways, and it is particularly important when you are managing somebody's personal wealth and there's a very small LP base.
Yeah, those are great comments, Hannah. And I think our family office is structured pretty similarly, where, in my experience, if you've got a family office, you've obviously been extremely successful, either as an entrepreneur or as an investor. And in my experience, that phenotype tends to leave to the experts, right? Their subject matter expertise. So I think for us, it's very similar, where, we approach our benefactors, we're much more mature in an opportunity. Sherry, any comments from your side on how you guys, how your family's involved?
Yes, there is a lot of differences among families and among the way they decide to look at investments. So this family office, the money allocated to Fox Hill is a small portion of the overall family's entire investment profile. So this is run sort of independently and more like a favored project of the family members. And in that sense, they are intimately involved ultimately with where they would like to look for investment and areas that are personal interest to them. So they're very involved among themselves. One of the hardest things was actually, because I'm working with 4 individuals who are decision makers, was to come up with a mechanism that instills some amount of discipline when you had a risk profile going from day trading commodities to turning over mutual funds. So the challenge was really in the beginning to find a common theme that everybody could buy into, some means of discipline about risk and timelines that fit the spectrum of the family's interests, as well as leverage. And one of the family's members is in healthcare. So I'm able to leverage that unique inside perspective in a lot of things we look at. So to make our decisions, we have periodic meetings sort of on the idea of an investment committee meeting. I've sorted through what are the leading possibilities, and then we discuss where they fit in the family's interests, what we do a scoring system, where they fit on the scoring system, and then ultimately make a decision collectively after that point. So it was really about narrowing the personalities to try to find a risk profile that was acceptable for essentially a risk-taking venture that they wanted to feel a personal involvement with.
Okay, that's great. Maybe next we'll turn it over to Sam. So what are some of the misconceptions you've heard about family offices? And do you believe any of these are true? I mean, there's been some people when we've met with saying, oh, it's a family office, are you as sophisticated as a traditional fund? And we operate almost exactly the same as a traditional fund. So maybe just a little different decision making. But Sam, what are your thoughts on misconceptions about family offices?
So misconceptions are mostly along the lines that they're really uninformed, they can't do due diligence properly, they can't really understand the structures of the deals, and that's clearly just not true. Family offices have gotten very sophisticated. We all have, attorneys that we rely on that are the same attorneys that the funds rely on. We all have access to people who can do due diligence just like the funds can do. So there's not really much of a difference between a fund and a family office, given it's a family office that's set up to primarily do deals. There are some family offices that aren't set up, and that probably is true of them. But of the ones that are set up to actually like do healthcare investing, they usually have deeper expertise in many of the areas. Now, again, you'll also find ones that only want to tag along on deals and want to follow due diligence of other people, but you'll know who those people are. But a family office that really says we'll take a lead on a deal, or is putting a significant amount of money in, you could be pretty sure they're doing all the due diligence themselves. They may be looking at other people's due diligences, but they're not relying on it. They're doing their own legal work. They're doing everything they need to do, just like a fund would.
Got it. And maybe that brings up an interesting point. Maybe if the panelists could raise your hand if you are willing to lead deals, because that's another misconception. So we've got 3 of the 4 that will lead deals. So very similar to traditional funds, which is great to see. Hannah, anything to add on any misconceptions that you've heard through your time?
Yeah, so I'd agree with Sam on that. I think that is evolving. I think now with more family offices being willing really to put in the effort, but also to invest in the resources of having independent direct investment funds. I think we have another pretty interesting perspective, since our overall portfolio includes both direct investments as well as investments in fund of funds. And so I actually, when I joined, had to sort of figure out how to walk a fine balance between, being, because if you wear both, you could wear both. I don't personally wear both GP and LP hats simultaneously, but since we do as a group, in the best case scenario, you're simultaneously co-investors as well as supporters of the managers. In the worst case scenario, you're simultaneously competitor and dumb money, right, to use a slightly derogatory term. And so actually walking that fine balance and accepting that I think institutional investors in this space, as well as entrepreneurs, will have their own perception about who you are, what your identity is, but then working with that and being relatively flexible has been something that I found to be useful, because the reality is all kinds of relationships are very useful.
Right. So besides, misconceptions about family offices, there are actually some benefits to being in a family office. So maybe let me turn it over to you, Nadav. What do you see why a company should choose a family office maybe over a traditional venture firm, or have some of each in their syndicate?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I can fully agree with what both Sam and Hannah said. I think especially within life sciences and healthcare, you see a lot of family offices which bring a very professional fund-like approach. We try to be fundamental, and we try to do our own diligence. I think when having a family office or considering a family office as part of your investors, you can earn, first of all, certain degree of flexibility. Some family office know to move faster than funds, and be easier on the decision process, not just in terms of time length, but also in terms of the interactions with the company. Be more I would say cautious with the entrepreneur's time, or do the diligence in a more I would say backlayed manner. And second of all, I think, and it was kind of like touched upon by the previous panelist, by the other panelists, sorry, that a lot of family offices bring strong networks where funds not usually or not necessarily have certain networks. Like, for example, access to different pools of capital not coming from other funds, or kind of like making introductions of other parts of the industry not related but can be helpful to entrepreneurs. I think it really pertains to the specific family office. But when you're dealing with, I would say, a professional family office, you can, in my perspective, benefit a lot. And perhaps a last idea that worth bear in mind, that a lot of family office can like squeeze in different equity positions. They don't necessarily require a specific, percentage. And by doing that, you can kind of like adopt to a certain deal structure, and yet bring some value, not just being a pure financial investor. So I think that that's another upside.
Great. I know for us, one attractive benefit, at least for me, is a lot of traditional venture funds are close-ended. So they have a certain time frame when they have to invest and return capital. And for us to have really just an open-ended budget-based strategy, we can certainly be long-term holders of companies, both private and even public. We're not forced to liquidate our shares or return capital as quickly, as long as we can still be profitable. So anyone else on the panel want to comment on that question about why someone should, what the benefits are of a family office?
Yeah, I think, Scott, you make an excellent point there about the flexibility a family office can offer, and also the willingness to look at hybrid structures and the lack of a defined timeline that has to be committed to with a certain exit. I think family offices are more forgiving in that sense, and they offer, I call it a patient investor viewpoint, knowing that really at the end, at least my family's office is seeing that the good work of the company can get done. It's not about having a return that has to be given back to limited partners within 4 years, for example. So I think the biggest reason is that flexibility and patience.
Yeah, that's a great comment. It's interesting you mentioned the word forgiving. From our experience, when you're working with, the family directly and it's their capital, forgiving is a little bit different than if you're working for institutional investors who are raising money from other sources of capital. So I definitely feel more personal responsibility to be a good steward of capital allocation and deployment. Maybe we can switch topics a little bit to early stage investing. That's the focus of the conference here at RESI. And all you guys have different strategies, but maybe starting with you, Sam, like how does your fund define and approach early stage investing?
So our fund likes to find early stage companies, so it's usually seed and A round, that have products, we're mostly in digital health, by the way, that are novel. We don't want to go into a competitive space. We're not looking for the company we're investing in to, be similar to many other companies, maybe a little better, but want to compete with them for market share. We'd like them to have a novel product that will be adopted and can be used by many people because it'll save time, it'll save money, it'll provide better outcomes. So those are the types of things we look for from our companies.
Okay. Sherry, what disease indications do you guys find interesting and why? Do you think there are some spaces that are overcrowded from an investor standpoint? And are any underserved that you're highly focused on?
Yes, actually, that's a really good point. Especially in the last 2 years, we've seen, and this echoes the way the business works in a sense. You have a couple of early success stories or new technologies, and everybody jumps on the bandwagon. So, right off the top of the head, COVID-19 is overexploited, whether it's on a diagnostic, a treatment basis, or any other connection. I think like Y2K and a number of other transformative events in the market, everybody jumps on a bandwagon. And I think that the COVID-19 has now gotten very crowded. And the second part of that is as new technology sort of gain some acceptance, and certainly with a certain amount of early success, other areas that have gotten very crowded are CAR-T. I had a conversation with a company yesterday about what's the reason why anybody wants to focus on relapsed AML as a market when you've got 65, 70, or 80 companies ahead of you already in clinical trials. So CAR-Ts, cell therapies that are using cell sources from the placenta to amniotic fluid, that to us has gotten very crowded, as well as the quasi-digital health companies that try to position themselves as being med tech, but they're really not much more than consumer-facing digital health. So we, as Sam was saying, we're looking for more innovative, more niche kinds of technologies that are really addressing a problem in a unique way, or are able to carve and stratify a space that's not been addressable before in a practical sense. And we think that's an important area to look at. So we're looking, for instance, at diseases of the senses. As you may know, certainly loss of smell has impact upon mental acuity. So we're looking at smell loss, we're looking at hearing loss, we're looking at disease states and that have been overlooked up until now.
Great. And so I know Hannah and I have known each other for a long time, and we actually chat about this quite often. So I am curious to hear your perspective as what subsectors you focused on now, either other underserved areas you're like, hey, this area is ripe for capital deployment.
Yeah, I mean, I think like other physicians on the panel, I do try to walk a fine balance between, I think, using that physician's gut and I think sort of recognition of true clinical need and potential impact, which, by the way, sometimes is different from your sort of, immediate reactions to opportunities. But also on the other side, sort of the more, scientific approach to looking at whether or not technologies are actually ready. And then, for sure, of course, layer on top of that, just the general level of activity within the industry. And I do find that it's a fine balance between all three of them because, ideas aren't quite ready to translate. Well, you can't do anything. But if there's no real interest in market among investors as well as pharma, then you can't find sufficient the right kind of capital source and to do that. And so I think, given that we're also patient capital, I think like others, we certainly have been and following and continue to be investors in the novel, newer therapeutic modalities like cell therapy and gene therapy. I would say that we have tried, and I think, Sherry, your points really resonate, to find a slightly different spin, right? So rather than autologous cell therapy for oncology, which we've already made a bet on, is it now marking towards allogeneic, or is it actually expanding to the flip side of the coin, looking at autoimmune diseases? Is there something there from a cell therapy perspective? And then similarly for gene therapy, our initial successes have been on gene replacement therapy. And so I think contemplation around, are there fundamental technology platforms that enable better delivery of nucleic acids in general that can overcome some of the limitations we have right now about immunogenicity, cargo capacity, or are there other opportunities like gene editing instead and base editing that we can go after? Now, I would also say, though, I think taking a step back, and we try to remind ourselves this often, is at the end of the day, science only carries so far. You need to make products, right? And so therapeutics is about actually turning out therapeutics. And so, there we like our human genetics guide us, but we also very much like product-driven small molecule biologics plays. And I think that's been very exciting, actually, to watch how ADCs perhaps is a good example. Whole fields, second time, third time around, and novel innovations that make them just that much more drug-like. So overall, I think it's a very exciting time, and that's part of what I love about this job is it's very hard to get bored.
Great. And I know many of you are from different geographies and have different geographic focuses. So, and I think I saw a question in the chat come up earlier. So are you guys geographically restricted in your focus or limited, or do you cover, different continents? Maybe we'll start with Nadav, since you're based overseas. Just how do you guys approach, geography and, really importantly, company oversight post-investment, which geography can be challenging sometimes?
Yeah, so actually 75% of our portfolio is located in North America. We're not restricted. I mean, if we'll see something interesting in Europe, we'll also do that. We try to leverage like our backyard, Israel, in terms of like talent and technologies. Some of our companies have their operations set in the US, but have R&D centers in Israel, kind of like leveraging that. And we're doing that in a couple of ways. I mean, first of all, we travel quite often, and we have offices in New York and Florida. For a couple of our funds are based there. And also we try to work with partners we can rely on in terms of kind of like dividing the work between us and them, and doing the diligence and afterwards, kind of like not creating any burden for the company that we are placed overseas. I think till now we're fortunate enough to see this working quite well.
Great. And then maybe turning to Sam, a lot of people are curious how family offices are involved post-investments. Maybe you can just comment on, once you make an investment, what kind of oversight do you provide the companies? How involved do you require board seats, observer seats, you passive?
So I think anybody that invests in early stage companies on a more institutional type of investment, I don't care whether it's a family office or a VC, really cares about their investment. And the only way you're going to really achieve good returns in the long run is if you do everything you can to help the company. So I would think that most family offices that are investing significant amounts of money in early stage healthcare do want to be involved, do want to be hands-on, do want to help out their portfolio companies. Many would want board seats. Many are happy with board observer seats. That's just style. But I think pretty uniformly, any family office that's gotten to the level that, like I said previously, they're doing due diligence, they're getting their attorneys involved, they're really, looking at this as a institutional type of investment, then they're going to also want to be involved and hands-on with the companies that they're investing in.
Great. Now maybe we'll turn briefly to sourcing investments. So a lot of you are focused on early stage opportunities. And so as a family office, what's your best way to source investments? Maybe we'll start with you, Sherry.
Sure. That's actually for us fairly simple because I get shown so many transactions that I can hardly keep up with them. But I prefer to outreach as opposed to look at what comes inbound. And I find conferences like RESI, several others that focuses on private and microcap public companies, gives me plenty to work with. And I also do a lot of academic meetings, and I will look for companies, among the credits in academic presentations as opportunities as well. So we source from largely from conferences, some inbound referrals, and academic opportunities.
Great. And Nadav, you're based, overseas in Israel. So, you just mentioned most of your investments were in North America. So maybe you can just comment on how you're thinking about sourcing. Yeah,
so first of all, there are lots of Israelis scattered in North America. Sometimes you can be surprised how many. So there's a nice network we can leverage. Everyone is like first degree of separation. But on top of that, we partner with lots of US funds, and we've been shown with lots of deals because, as I've said, because our flexibility, sometimes they need a partner for a syndication. Sometimes it's too early for them, and we can kind of like take the first lead by doing this deal. So I guess it's a combination of different venues, and I fully agree with Sherry. We try to participate in conferences like RESI and also in terms of being involved with academia and different places. All these are creating a pretty wealthy deal flow to now.
Great. And Hannah, to you, does the family often send you deals and, you have to look through a lot of them and spend your time on that? Or is this up to you to go find what's interesting?
Yeah, actually, our family does not. When they do, I always do my very best to assist in any way. And so I think we're fairly active. I'm a big believer that sitting around things that come in with no effort, unless you're already a very established brand name, I think that there's a negative selection to that. So we certainly hunt for deals. My personal preference is that the best deals still come from other investors, like-minded investors, as well as entrepreneurs that you've worked with. And so that's one thing that we very actively cultivate and continue to grow. And it's always a two-way street, right? So we can't continue to be takers all the time. And so in that way, I think we also share our deals, and we do primary research on our own as well, routinely on specific spaces where we think are interesting. And so often in the process of that, we develop judgment, we find KOLs, and then and we find entrepreneurs and new technologies. And so, you know, those also we share. And I think that's one of the things that I have learned over time is, you know, you can't invest in biotech, you can't invest in bad science in biotech, but there are many other things that can ruin a really great company, one of which is to have the wrong syndicate or wrong board. And so I think this is an extremely important part of the business. The other part is, you know, how to say no and yet give something back to both the entrepreneurs as well as your colleagues who shared it with you. And that's an art, and I think it's also just proper etiquette, which we continue to refine on our side.
Great. What I think would be interesting for the audience to hear, if everyone's willing to, is just describe how you sourced your most recent investment. You don't have to mention names, but where it came from would be really interesting. Maybe we'll start with Sam.
So our most recent investment came from a board member of the company who worked previously with my partner.
Okay. So it's a, you know, board member of the company. So your boards are helpful, importantly, for networking, and that's good to hear. How about Nadav?
Yeah, so actually our most recent investment come from an entrepreneur we've been following for a couple of months now, kind of like try to help him, no strings attached. And when he decided to raise funds, hopefully, happily, we were his first phone call. It was great.
Great. Sherry?
Yes, our most recent investment came from a contact that I knew when he was a principal at a hedge fund. He actually left the hedge fund and had joined the boards of a couple of companies and then was an advisor to the company we eventually invested in. So it was known, he was a known contact to me.
Okay. And Hannah?
For us, the most recent one was a company actually that was started by one of the other investors in the brand name venture fund that I've had a long-term relationship with. And so this particular investor was very kind to be almost like a big brother mentor, I would say, since the beginning of my time in the industry. And, you know, for years, we tried to find something to work on together. And then this one finally came together. And so that's the other thing that I would say is that what's really rewarding also in this business is it is about relationships, but sometimes those don't necessarily pay off until years and years into the future. But it really does pay to develop good relationships, to build connections, and then to continue to build also internal knowledge base in science and technology so that you can, you know, jump on opportunities when the time is right.
Right. So hearing from all of you, it's all of the recent deals that you just invested in came from either people you've known or someone that you've met and followed for the last 4 to 6 months and seen how they've progressed. And so, you know, I guess that sort of begs the question, like you know, the importance of everyone's network is key, not just of investors, but for the entrepreneurs in the audience, you know, try to meet, you know, other investors as much as you can. And so what no one said is, oh, I met this company at a conference. So how important are conferences for deal sourcing for all of you? And I know as you guys think about that, I mean, I've had a bunch of meetings at RESI, and I've always found, you know, conferences such as RESI and others to be really helpful in just broadening out the network. And I've met company entrepreneurs that 6 months later, when the fit was better, we re-engaged. And so I'm a believer in networking, and I think this is a people business, and it's important to build out your network as much as possible wherever that may be. You know, maybe, you know, Nadav, if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree, and also with the wise words of Hannah. I mean, it's all about building and expanding your network, and in these conferences, you might have just I don't know, a nice chat with someone. It won't lead to anything, but suddenly in a couple of months or even years, it will converge to something meaningful. So I do think it's a great opportunity to meet new people, hear about exciting companies. Sometimes it can lead to, I don't know, a collaboration with our portfolio company, not necessarily an investment, but it's a great opportunity and great use of time in my perspective. So don't give up on RESI on all these conferences.
Right. And as you think about when you source investments, turning to the diligence process, how, maybe you can describe what your diligence process is like. Is it, similar to others of you that have worked for both, family offices, institutional funds? Are there any differences in diligence process? How long is your diligence process? Just give the audience a sense for what to expect. And maybe we'll start with Hannah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the fundamentals are no different. And if anything, because we are more bandwidth constrained than we are capital constrained, I almost have to keep the bar even higher in terms of what opportunities we end up spending time on and actually deep digging into. And so the basics, right? How solid the science is, the team, the potential clinical impact, the market, and then other people who are sort of involved, both investors as well as other board members. So those are definitely there, for sure. I would say that, the other thing that I do try also to, spend some time thinking about is, what is it that we can bring that beyond capital? And I think sometimes it is connections. All venture capitalists have lots of connections, and so that in and of itself sometimes isn't unique. But I would say because we have patient capital and we have the ability to stay with the company, sometimes there are opportunities where I think we provide, especially during the hard times, right? During the good times, it's always good, but during the harder times, can we do something? The other thing I would also say is that having a principal who's an entrepreneur's entrepreneur, I do think that can be helpful. It's a mind frame. It's a frame of mind about how you think about innovation and when you double down or when how you actually mitigate risk. So that we actually do layer on top of that as well.
Great. Sam, maybe you can just comment on your diligence process. If you have to give a rough estimate from meeting the company to closing a financing, what's the typical length of time our audience should expect to spend raising capital?
So Hannah brought up a really good point that sometimes you get so inundated with deals. By the time you're looking at the one or two that you're able to really give a lot of attention to, you've already done a lot of weeding. So you already know a lot about that company. You already know that you really love the team. You already know that it's got great science or it'll make a great impact. Now you have to get down to the, to the nitty gritty and say, what's their IP like? Is the business plan going to work? What's their marketing strategy? All the things that are not, science and will this work and, great technology. It just, will the business work? So that takes time. And then there's, no way to say that I could do that in a week. I mean, that literally takes minimum 3 to 4 weeks if I'm pushed really, really hard and not doing much else because I've got other things I've got to do too, right? So, and you got to hear back from your lawyer sometimes, and you got to hear back from other consultants and KOLs. And I think the minimum realistic time that I could do a due diligence if I were pushed is 3 to 4 weeks.
Okay. And how, as you find these new opportunities, and there's obviously a lot coming, especially over the last year with COVID, with everyone on Zoom, it feels like, it's just easier for everyone to reach out. So the number of deals everyone's looked at, I'm sure, is higher than a typical year. So people, are going through a lot of plans and presentations. I mean, what do you look for that really jumps out at you, that makes you say, hey, look, this is an interesting company. I really gonna have to follow up with this as opposed to moving on to the next opportunity. Maybe we'll start with Sherry.
Sure. And interestingly enough, I'll kind of use an example that came from a company that I met at RESI, I guess, in March. There's two things that stand out for me, and maybe because I've been on the investment business so long. One is how the presentation is balanced between whatever is the sciences per se, and what is an understanding of why the technology is going to be useful as a product, and how that product can impact the market. So to stand out for us, I look for that balance between the science and the business side of it. And also, if the problem is explained in a new way that shows a different logic of approaching it, that is also something else that becomes a differentiating factor, because it says to me the management is looking around themselves, and we call it an adjacency principle, where you look around your central focus and understand what's going on to fully appreciate how your path might have to be moved or adjusted as you go on down the marketplace. So it's very important for us to see that balance in the management, and also to be cognizant of, I think what Sam was talking about, it takes time. When we look at deals that somebody says, I'm going to have 25 million in EBITDA in 3 years, it's like, I don't know of any company that's done that in my practical experience. So it really comes down to the logic of why the product's going to fit a niche, why it's going to be accepted, and then its execution, knowing where you have risk as execution and planning for the worst case and the best case.
Okay. Nadav, what about yourself? What grabs your attention when you're screening your slide decks and business plans?
Yeah, so I think that as much as I want to be prepared for a meeting, and I will meet a company only after I review their deck and be, at least a bit educated about, the general field, to have hopefully an efficient meeting. I mean, I would expect entrepreneurs to do the same. So we have a lot of information on our website. We have a blog to share our thoughts. We have, our portfolio, so they can learn a lot about, us. And so when you're meeting someone who can say, listen, I know that this is the type of technologies that get you excited because these are the companies you invested in, or I really like these blog posts that you recently shared, and we're doing something very similar. I think those kind of things kind of like catch my attention. I would say they seem like a diligent, entrepreneurs. If they're diligent in this process, they will be diligent and will execute well with their company.
Great. Okay.
Maybe Scott, if I could interrupt, maybe I'll just add one more thing.
Yes.
I don't underestimate the attractiveness of being a charismatic and engaging person. Realize that on the other side, sort of like being an interviewer, right, for like college or something, and the person on the other side might be sitting there all day listening to lots and lots of pitches. And so these are relationships which potentially could mean it's a decade once you make that investment. And so developing that relationship immediately, even if it's via Zoom, I think that's really important. And I am often thinking about, well, is this a company? Is this a group of people that I'd love to be in a boardroom with for hours and hours, regularly? So I think, also be yourself. I think I agree with everything else that the other panelists have said, but don't underestimate that component.
Right. And so, maybe turning to Sam, first impressions are important, right? Whether it's meeting a company, in person at a conference like RESI, whether it's an email with a slide deck. So, how can someone make a really good impression for you? What advice you have to go, maybe we say, hey, look, as an entrepreneur, you should maybe focus on, a couple things that could like make the difference when you first meet a potential investor.
So one of the big things that at least I have found to be a big turnoff is when there are mistakes in the slide deck that's being presented. Okay, spelling mistakes, mistakes in just categorizing different things, because I follow the slide decks that they're that they're showing me. And sometimes, you know, they'll put a chart up and two sides are you know, they're mischarted. And I ask about it. Oh yeah, that was a mistake. And you know, I don't want to, it's hard for me to want to invest in a company that didn't take time to prepare the key material that they're going to try to get me to be an investor. So number one, be prepared. Make sure your decks are well presented. You know, I mean, they don't have to be perfect. They don't have to have the most beautiful colors and you know, style, but no spelling mistakes, no charting mistakes. Just have and have it in a concise order and tell a story. Another thing that I notice on a lot of decks that I get is I don't understand the product. I'm presented something, I get all the catchphrases in the world, but I don't know what the product is doing. And I ask, what does it do? And it's like, I can't even get a straight answer sometimes. You know, and I say, let's say I'm the physician, for instance, what do I do with that product? How am I going to give it to my patients? How are they going to benefit out of it? Just simple things. Think of the user of that product. It doesn't have to be a doctor, it could be a patient. It could be, you know, it could be somebody putting on a wearable. But what are they going to do and how are they going to benefit out of it? And that story is so important that I think that the entrepreneurs need to be able to explain.
So, Hannah, we just heard Sam emphasize the importance of, you know, careful, you know, diligence on your slide deck, making sure there's no errors in your charts and graphs. You know, how important for you is the slide deck? Because a lot of times a company will send you materials. Sometimes they'll send me an executive summary, which is a half a page long. That is so frustrating for me because it's not enough to know. And then I have to reach back out and say, well, can you send something longer? And I do that no matter what, because I can't make a decision. So ideally, it would be great to receive a slide deck to learn more about the company. So Hannah, how important is, like, should these entrepreneurs really be focused on the quality of the slide deck and, you know, clarity? I mean, how do you think about that? It's so many cases it's, you know, you've been referred to a company, you may not have met anyone on the team before. It's really your first introduction to their quote unquote product.
Yeah, I think it's super important. And, you know, I think having a management consulting program background, I do try to be also give people a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, but otherwise I could, you know, err on being too picky. But Sam, I agree with you. I like you, I find the sort of one pager tier sheets very frustrating. I also in general find large upfront introductions where they always invariably end up at $1 billion market size to be frustrating because either there's a need or not, and we all have to figure it out and do a double click on that, but I don't need those sort of generalities. In biotech, I do think that you need to share enough data in order to convince the investor that there is a there. So at least take a phone call. I would say there is one pet peeve that I have, I think in the first interactions with the investors, and sometimes that is through the deck and sometimes it's in person. And that is this practice of, if, you know, the investor actually asks you a question and the answer is, no, I'm going to get to it. Can I just go through still slides 3 to 7 before I get to that, right? So it suggests to me an inability to actually own the topic and live in it. And I think ultimately great entrepreneurs need to be able to pitch their idea in 2 minutes, 20 minutes, 2 hours, or 2 days. And so you need to know the audience, you need to be able to be flexible. And so in constructing that deck, I know it's hard because sometimes you don't know who the recipient is. Maybe spend a little bit of thought on, you know, who could they be, and adapting the decks, I think appropriately, can go a long way. Pretty pictures are great always, but, you know, we do look at enough pretty pictures that we are looking for substance, even if it's the first interaction.
Sherry, what are some of the most common mistakes you've seen at early stage companies?
Yes, I think there are two common mistakes. One is the company that's got the entrepreneur who does feel he can do it all. And it's usually under the guise, well, I don't have sufficient resources to hire people around me. But at the end of the day, even when he interacts with some of his outside consultants, you see that it's a micromanagement problem, and there's just no way a company can develop into a successful commercial enterprise unless there's a team involved. So that's one mistake, is to believe that you can do it without a team. The second one I run into is the science experiment that's being billed as a product. And looking at early stage companies, a lot of them have some very exciting technology, but there's no understanding how to take that, particularly in the biotech space, from where they are on a lead optimization, as an example, and make a commercial product out of it, because they typically will talk about the market size and not talk about how they're specifically going to address the market. So as I said in my prior comments, having a management team that can express the business case and why the business case is going to make sense by the time they get their product developed is really important. And the last mistake, I call it the hockey stick revenue projection. It just never happens. And if they said it's going to happen, if they're going to get to this milestone in 6 months, you can figure it's going to be a year in 6 months. So management really do need to understand timelines better and appreciate that it's better to be upfront about the timeline than it is to have the timeline mixed.
Nadav, turning to you. So before a company goes out to raise their financing round, what recommendations do you have for them to be best prepared? Any mistakes or issues they should avoid?
I mean, there are plenty, right? So I will try to mark a few, and I'm sure the other panelists will have other, great ideas. I mean, first of all, and it's kind of like, I'll follow what Sam and Hannah said. You need to have something cohesive. You need to have something you can explain in 2 sentences. And if you can't, that's a problem. We see too many companies using too many, buzzwords and empty words, like it's a platform, I'm utilizing AI, I'm doing a decision support, which doesn't really mean anything. So I want to understand what your company is doing, and if you're pitching it, you need to make sure it's a very simple explanation. Otherwise, it simply won't work. That's one. And second of all, I think you need to be, at least for us, I mean, if it's just a technology with no apparent business plan or even, a suggestion, why would someone actually pay something for that? That's a bit too early in our perspective, at least in digital health. I mean, it's obviously that's different, from other fields, but you need to, make your homework in terms of like doing things beyond, the viability of the technology.
Great. And I think we have probably time for one more question as we're coming to the end of our hour. And I saved my favorite question for last, which is about the future. And so we've seen a extremely active biotech and device market over the last couple of years. We were fortunate to be in an industry where COVID didn't affect us as much as other industries, and people were still extremely active in deployment of capital from the investment side and companies raising capital. So, indices are quite robust. Biotech and medtech have had good runs, even the diagnostic space as well. I am curious how bullish this group is for the future. So do you think our pace of IPOs and fundraising will continue over the next few years? Are you neutral or are you bearish? Short answers, let's just go around the table. We'll start with Sam.
Very bullish.
Excellent.
Basically, I think we're just at the beginning of this, and healthcare costs are going up and we got to lower them.
Hannah? Hannah's on mute, but I'm going to try to read her lips and no.
Bullish. Bullish.
Bullish. Sherry?
I'm very bullish, but I think we'll have periods of volatility that will provide some great buying opportunities.
Nadav?
I agree with Sherry, and I will also add that, it depends on a specific field. There are certain fields that are currently overhyped and we'll see them kind of like cool down, while in others there are many more opportunities.
Right. So this has been a fantastic session. I really want to thank the four panelists here, Nadav, Sam, Sherry, and Hannah did an outstanding job, and hope the audience appreciated your comments and perspective. And thanks everyone for attending, and hope everyone has a great rest of the RESI conference.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.